You know of that? I mean, if you get any books, almost any books from, well, they're not the only ones, but they are the major publisher of books on religion and spirituality in India. So many, they have hundreds of books on Buddhism, Vedanta, other schools of Hinduism, comparative East-West philosophy, Tantra, Indian culture. The family that publishes behind Multil Banasidas is the Jain family. That's their last name is Jain, because they're Jains. Then the other major Indian publisher is called Munshiram Manoharlal. It's also a Jain company run by Jains. Okay, maybe that's a rundown on Jainism in 40 minutes or so. And I'm not an expert on Jainism, so if you have really technical questions, I'll have to admit that I can't answer. But if you have any questions or comments on anything that I've just covered, then please feel welcome to ask. Okay, then we'll go into the sutta. And one thing that one notices in the Buddhist texts, in the early suttas, the Buddha, or early Buddhism was flourishing in a section in India at a time when there were multiple schools of thought arising, flourishing, circulating their ideas, debating, discussing different ideas with each other, sometimes competing for the allegiance of the householders. But we see in numbers of suttas the Buddha encounter Brahmins. When he encounters Brahmins, the tone of the conversation is generally cordial and friendly. The Buddha doesn't accept some of the ideas of the Brahmins, some of the basic ideas. Particularly, he doesn't agree with the attempts of the Brahmins to impose a rigid class system on the people of India of that period. He doesn't agree with the idea that those in the upper class, social classes, have some kind of spiritual entitlement that the people in the lower classes don't have. And the Buddha holds that people from any social class are capable of developing good conduct, capable of developing the mind and maturing wholesome qualities, and that anybody from any social class is able to achieve the ultimate goal of enlightenment, nirvana, liberation. The Buddha rejects the sanctity of the Vedas, which was a key tenet of the Brahmins. And he says that any kind of scriptures, no matter how old, should be examined for their truth. But the Buddha and the Buddhists generally remain cordial within their relationship with the Brahmins. But when you see the Buddhists coming into discussions with the Jains, as we'll see in this sutta, often the tone can become quite caustic, quite severe. And so we're going to see some of that here. And so this raises the thought that since there are so many similarities between the Jains and the Buddhists, and also they were both flourishing in the same part of India, and they both had monastic orders which depended upon support from the householder community. And so there was, in a way, something of a competition for a following, that could have influenced the way the texts came to be formulated. Okay, so here the Buddha, now we come back to the text where he left it. The Buddha speaks about some recluses and Brahmins who hold the view that whatever this person feels, whether pleasure or pain or neutral feeling, all that is caused by what was done in the past. So we know that this is, as he'll say just below, this is the view of the Nigantas, the Jains. And now we come to their distinctive tenet. So by annihilating with asceticism past actions or past karma, and by doing no fresh actions, creating no new karma, there will be no consequence in the future, no consequence in the form of another rebirth with pleasant and painful experiences in that next rebirth. So with no consequence in the future, there is the destruction of action, that of all of the karma that is defiling the soul is eliminated. With the destruction of action, there is the destruction of suffering. With the destruction of suffering, there is the destruction of feeling. With the destruction of feeling, all suffering will be exhausted. So that, sort of in a nutshell, is the Jain scheme of liberation. Okay, so the Buddha, now he says that he approaches the Nigantas and he questions them whether it's true that this is their teaching. Okay, and so some of the Jains, I guess the more knowledgeable ones, will admit this. And so now the Buddha is going to question them further. So he says, do you know for a fact that you existed in the past and that you did not exist? So they say no. Do you know that you did evil actions in the past and did not abstain from them? They say no. Do you know that you did these specific evil actions? They say no. Do you know that so much suffering has already been exhausted or eliminated, that so much suffering remains to be exhausted, or that when so much suffering has been exhausted, all suffering will have been exhausted? They say no. Do you know what the abandoning of unwholesome states is and what the cultivation of wholesome states is here and now? They say no. Okay, now the next paragraph, the Buddha simply just sort of reviews what they've admitted, that they do not know that they existed in the past, and so on, all the ways to that they do not know that eventually, all according to their way of practice, all suffering will be exhausted. Okay, then paragraph 6, the Buddha says, if you knew that you existed in the past and that it is not the case that you did not exist, and so on and so forth, and if you knew that when so much suffering has been exhausted, all suffering will have been exhausted, or if you knew what the abandoning of unwholesome states is and what the cultivation of wholesome states is here and now, that being so, it would be fitting for the Venerable Nigantas to declare whatever this person feels, all that has been caused by what was done in the past, and with the destruction of feeling, all suffering will be exhausted. Okay, I'm going to skip over the simile and just jump to paragraph 9, where here the Buddha was here. This is a direct continuation of the argument. Then the Buddha says, but now since you do not know that you existed in the past, and that it is not the case that you did not exist, And since you do not know any of the other things, and you do not know what the abandoning of unwholesome states is, and what the cultivation of wholesome states is here and now, it is not fitting for the Venerable Nigantas to declare whatever this person feels, all that is caused by what was done in the past. By annihilating with asceticism past actions, and by doing no new actions, there will be no consequence in the future. And so on. With the destruction of suffering, there is the destruction of feeling. With the destruction of feeling, all suffering will be exhausted. Okay, so now if we look at this, basically it's saying that the Jains are making certain claims. They're making claims based on certain hypotheses. They don't know, or based on certain premises, certain presuppositions. They don't know the truth of these propositions for themselves. So therefore, they're not justified in promulgating their basic map of the path to liberation. Doesn't that seem to be a fair summary of what's being said here? I wish Yu Rong was here today, because she's good in playing so-called the devil's advocate or Mara's advocate. I don't like to be, as a monk, to be thrown in that role myself. But does anything seem problematic about this argument from our Buddha's point of view? Yeah,
I'm not so sure that it's problematic, but with Buddhist faith, we place our faith in the Buddha, even when we don't know.
Yeah.
We can safely say, I don't know my past life.
Okay. Oh, I just got distracted a little bit.
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know my past life, but I have faith in the words and the teachings of the Buddha, which is part and parcel of Buddhist practice.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I say, I think I've taught thousands of times as a monk, well, it's through our beginningless greed, hatred, and delusion that we've created this karma, and so we have this store of, immeasurable store of karma from the past. It's our defilements and karma in conjunction that bring us into the present life. And when we act motivated by the defilements, we're creating new karma. And this new karma is going to, as long as we have the defilements, the new karma is going to bring us forward into future lives. And so we're going to be experiencing this boundless suffering of samsara because of our defilements and karma that we've been activating and creating in the present. And the Buddha himself says, okay, I think it's in the Samyutta Nikaya, chapter 15, the sutta on the beginningless round of samsara, Anamataga Samyutta, that, O monks, the first point cannot be found of beings roaming and wandering through the cycle of birth and death. Anamatago yang bhikkhave samsaro. Without a conceivable beginning, O monks, is the cycle of birth and death. The first point cannot be found of beings roaming and wandering from life to life, hindered by ignorance and fettered by craving. And then what do you think, O monks? What is more? The tears that you have shed roaming and wandering from life to life, or the water as you've been weeping over the loss of mother, loss of father, loss of sons, loss of daughters, loss of brothers and sisters, this or the waters in the four great oceans? Then the monks answer as they should. As we understand the Dharma, this is more the water in the four great... As we understand the Dharma, this is more the tears that we have shed over the loss of mother, loss of father, brother, sister, son, and daughter. This is much, much greater than the waters in the four great oceans. Okay, if I think in the present life, okay, when my mother passed away, okay, I shed a few tears. I haven't lost any sons and daughters. I have one sister and she's still alive. One cousin who passed away before me. Aunts and uncles I hardly knew, for I didn't know well enough to shed tears over them. So not that many tears. And yet, I take it on faith as a Buddha, on trust, that the tears that I've shed in beginningless samsara are much greater than the waters in the four great oceans. So, suppose some Jain ascetic comes up to me and says, well, Bhante, do you know that you've shed more tears over loss of mother, loss of father? No. Do you know that you've been wandering from life to life through ignorance and craving? No. Do you know that the samsara is without conceivable beginning? No. So then the Jain ascetic could say to me, well then, but since, friend Bhante Bodhi, you do not know that you existed in the past and that you did not exist, you do not know that you've been wandering through beginningless time in this samsara, you do not know that you've been bound by ignorance and hindered by ignorance and bound by craving, you do not know that you've shed so many tears over your loss of mother, loss of father, loss of brother, loss of sister. Therefore, friend Bodhi, it is not fitting for you to declare that this samsara is without beginningless, without discernible beginning. No first point can be discerned of beings roaming and wandering from life to life, hindered by ignorance and fettered by craving. What am I going to say? Well, that's not the way I would usually. In fact, I've been sort of challenged like that by, skeptics and non-Buddhists and people who come to listen to lectures on Buddhism out of curiosity. And then there's a generation now of what they call secular Buddhists, people who don't accept the idea of rebirth and of beginningless samsara and karma coming from past lives. But they say that all of these are just metaphors that the Buddha used to make his teaching intelligible to the people of his time, or just cultural baggage that the Buddha took on because he was, grew up in Indian culture. Okay, so I'm challenged like that, and what do I say? I say, well, I have trust in the Buddha Gautama, who doesn't claim to be omniscient and all-seeing, at least according to the oldest texts, but who claims to have known this through his direct knowledge. And on this basis, he says, and maybe if I have the Samyutta Nikaya on hand, I'll open up to chapter 15 and say, see, this is what the Buddha says in chapter 15. Or if I have, well, we have the Majjhima Nikaya on hand. Let's open up to Sutta number 4. Go to page 105. You say the Buddha here says, when my concentrated mind was thus purified and so on, I directed it to knowledge of the recollection of past lives. I recollected my many past lives, 1 birth, 2 births, 100,000 births, many aeons of world expansion and contraction. And then going further down to paragraph 29, with my concentrated mind, I directed it to the knowledge of the passing away and rebirth of beings. And so I saw beings passing away and taking rebirth. And I understood how I saw beings passing away and taking rebirth, inferior and superior, fair and ugly, unfortunate, fortunate and unfortunate. And I understand how beings pass on according to their karma. Thus, those who did bad deeds of body, speech, and mind, they met with misfortune in their present lives, and those who do good deeds by body, speech, and mind re-arise in good realms and meet with good fortune. Okay, so I point to the text and say, that's my authority. The Buddha knew this for himself. I have trust, faith in the Buddha, and so on the basis of my faith, basis on trust that the texts have been handed down reliably, I have trust that the texts are speaking quite literally, that they're not intended metaphorically or poetically. And so I say, that's my basis. So why can't the Jains say, this is our basis? It seems to me, I have to say, unfair. Am I missing something? If I am, then somebody tell me. Don't think Bhante must be a Jain mole who's been somehow planted in Drangyen Monastery. to lead the devout Buddhists of Drangyen Monastery to Jainism.
There is a difference, I think, between belief and knowledge.
Yeah, okay.
Because I'm also thinking of the Sutta to the Kalamas, where he's saying, don't believe this just because I say it, or any of the other people say it. Something that's coming to me about why he may have been so hard against the Jains were the people that he was practicing with when he was having just a few grains of rice before he came to the middle way. Were they Jains? Because I've often thought they were.
That's an interesting question.
And a very fundamental thing that really, I think, within a few weeks at the most, led to his enlightenment was cutting off from the ascetic practices.
Yeah, the practices that the Buddha undertook during his period of striving were very much like the practices that the Jains undertake. And the Buddha, of course, he rejected that mode of practice. And he, within his scheme of the middle path, he put it over as one of the two extremes to be avoided by one who has gone forth from the world. It's the extreme of attakila matanu yoga, devotion to self-mortification. And the Jain practice is, at least it's described very much as a kind of self-mortification. Did somebody have...
Bhante, I think in regard to faith or religions are the same. Maybe what the practitioner begins with faith, but I think in Buddhism, faith can be verified through practice. So eventually,
okay, we say faith can be verified through practice. I mean, I don't know much about the advanced stages of practice in Jainism, but I'm wondering if the Jain ascetics, would say that they can verify their principles through practice.
Unless they know how much karma they had created in the past, because their way of practicing is through austerity to wear off the karma.
Actually, this brings up a good point, that if their aim is going to be the eradication of karma, that seems to be a good point, then they should know that their practices are actually eradicating karma.
But all through their practice, they cannot verify that point.
That seems to be quite a good point, yeah, that they can verify that their practices are actually eradicating karma, and that they can't determine how much karma that they've eradicated. So in that way, yeah, I would say that the Buddha's argument does have some strength to it. Or that the Buddha does have a good argument against the Jains on that point. Very, very good.
That's not my point.
Excuse me?
That's not my point.
That's not your point.
Yeah, I'm not that wise. That's my friend's Venerable's point.
Excuse me?
Remember I was, that's Venerable Gurmei's point.
Excuse me?
That's another monk's point.
Oh.
Yeah, I have to admit that.
Okay, it's a good point. Okay, this is from the internet, this question. Somebody says, I wonder if the Buddha's extreme ascetic practice prior to enlightenment has some source from the Jain teaching or from his two meditation teachers. It actually seems to be, the extreme ascetic practices seem to be quite different from the teachings that were given by the two meditation teachers. Of course, in his account of the training under the two meditation teachers, there's no mention of austerities. All that's mentioned is the practice aimed at these formless meditative attainments, the base of nothingness and the base of neither perception or non-perception. But the first part of this question is actually exactly the question that Barbara asked before, that it's possible, the Buddha doesn't mention actually coming into contact with Jains prior to his enlightenment, but he did have an association with 5 other ascetics who looked to the Buddha as sort of their already, or the Bodhisattva, we call them at that point, as their leader, their exemplar. And it's said, in the commentaries, excuse me, that the 5 ascetics came actually from the Sakyan state, that they were Sakyans, or at least one of them, Kundanya, was a Brahmin who had left the Sakyan state and then came down to follow the Bodhisattva in his ascetic practices. But the Buddha must have picked up these ascetic practices. I can't say whether he picked them up actually from the Jains themselves, because the ascetic practices were probably shared by a number of other sects and schools from the period. But this was like one of the widespread means of practice amongst the spiritual communities. And the Jains would have been at least one group that exemplified, that retained these ascetic practices. So I don't know whether the Buddha himself actually directly learned them from the Jains or just picked them up from the dominant mode of practice of that period. But certainly the Buddha even prior to his enlightenment, he saw that the ascetic practices don't lead to enlightenment, and then he rejected them. and struck out with the middle way, which avoids that extreme of ascetic practice. And because of, the Buddha's middle way of practice, the Jain scriptures speak about the Buddhists as those so-called bhikkhus. They think of the Buddhists as being sort of pseudo-renunciants because they see that the Buddhists don't undertake the long fasts and they wear robes that cover the whole body and they live in fairly comfortable dwelling places. Actually, the Jains have their monasteries, but their way of life is more austere. I had my own one encounter with Jains in India this was 1975, when I went to visit, this holy sacred places of Buddhism in India. So I went to, the main place was Bodh Gaya, which is the site of the Buddha's enlightenment. But I took a little side trip to Rajagaha, which is not so far from Bodh Gaya. And then I went at Rajgir to the bamboo grove, which was one of the Buddha's favorite dwelling places, the site of, the bamboo grove was the monastery outside Rajagaha. And then one day I went into the town, and there was a Jain, this was fairly soon after the rains retreat, it must have been November, and that's a time when there's a major Jain festival. And so there was a large group of the Jain ascetics who come to Rajgir for this festival. And these were the naked ascetics. And I saw there were a couple of Thai monks from Thailand, who were sort of attached themselves to the group that was going for the festival. And so I thought I would stick around or attach myself to the group. So I sort of linked up with the Thai monks and we went to observe the festival. And the Jain people were very, very friendly to us. But they didn't seem to regard us, as being real ascetics. They were thinking like, our monks are the real ascetics. But you guys with your robes, and the Thai monks had cameras. You're just amateurs sort of playing at being monks. Yeah, Michael?
I'd like to ask a question about the production of karma, the continuation of karma, and doing harm to self as opposed to doing harm to others, because it seems to me, my instincts tell me that if I do great harm to myself, I'm actually creating karma.
Yeah.
So therefore, this level of asceticism would also be karma producing.
I think that would be so, definitely so from a Buddha's point of view. But the way the Jains see it, this is the means of wearing out the old karma, of sort of burning up the old karma.
But from a Buddhist point of view,
yeah, this is actually quite an important point. And what the Buddha teaches, you could see this in Sutta number 51, if we go back to that sutta. The Buddha speaks about 4 modes of practice, which the first 3 of which he rejects. Let me get the right page. It actually starts on page 445 at the top. There are 4 kinds of persons to be found existing in the world. What are the 4? A certain kind of person torments himself and pursues the practice of tormenting himself. Another kind of person torments others and pursues the practice of torturing others. Then a third kind of person torments himself and pursues the practice of torturing himself, and also torments others and pursues the practice of torturing others. And then there's the fourth kind of person who does not torment himself and does not torment others. And since he neither torments himself nor others, he is here and now hungerless, extinguished, and cooled, and he abides experiencing bliss, Brahma Bhutena Atana, with a self that's become divine. Okay, then when he comes to explain the kind of person who torments himself, then he lists or enumerates all of these types of ascetic practices. That's on page 446. That's the person who goes naked, who doesn't stop when asked, he doesn't accept food under certain conditions. He observes various kinds of ascetic practices regarding food. He clothes himself in hemp or in these rather rough types of clothing. He pulls out the hair and beard. I believe that's a Jain practice as well, or at least it might be a practice recommended for the Jains. I don't know that all of them do that. I think they shave the way the Buddhists do. Who stands continuously rejecting seats, that's a Jain ascetic practice. One who squats continuously, maintaining the squatting position, that's also a kind of Jain practice. And one who uses a mattress of spikes, again, that might be a Jain practice. Yeah, so those are the practices of torturing oneself that the Buddha rejects as being harmful and fruitless. Okay, I think we'll stop now and we'll continue with this sutta next week. And we could have some discussion after lunch, say about 12:10 we'll gather here. Okay, so let us end with the sharing of the merits. So we share the merits with the devas, the bhutas or fair spirits, the nagas, the dragon spirits, and with all beings, wishing them to rejoice in these merits and protect the sasana, protect the world, protect ourselves and others. Akasata chabhumata deva naga mahitika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu sasanang. Akasata chabhumata deva naga mahitika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu desanang. Akasata chabhumata deva naga mahitika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu mang parang. Etavatacham hehi sampadang punya sampadang sabbe devanumodantu Sabba sampati siddhya etavatacham hehi sampadang punya sampadang sabbe bhutanumodantu sabba sampati siddhya etavatacham hehi sampadang punya sampadang sabbe satanumodantu sabba sampati siddhya bhavagupadaya vichihetato etantare satakayupapanna rupya rupicha sanya sanino dukkha pamuchantu pusantu nibbutting. Okay, we could stand. And we end with 3 half bows.